Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Interpreting Table Talk. We have with us today one of the leading contemporary scholars in interpreting studies, co-editor-in-chief of Benjamin's Interpreting Journal, author of countless journal articles, 3 monographs, and 8 edited volumes. Please welcome Franz Verschacker. Franz, we are here today to talk first and foremost about two books that you released in very rapid succession. The Routledge Encyclopedia of Interpreting Studies, that was released in 2015, and the second edition of Introducing Interpreting Studies, released in 2016. This is what we usually refer to as Irish twins. For starters, could you tell us how, if at all, these two books relate to one another? After all, you must have been working on both, more or less in parallel.
Well, I think it could be seen as pure temporal coincidence. In principle, the two books are not related or were not supposed to be related. The idea that an updated edition would be needed was clear in the maybe even 6-7 years ago. I knew I had this coming. The publisher would expect the second edition. So in terms of the publisher's expectations, there would simply be a second edition of this book with no connection to this project, a completely separate project of editing an encyclopedia. But when this expectation of the publisher was made very explicit, that now is the time and this should be happening, I had just committed to editing the encyclopedia, and then it was clear to me that I wanted to sequence this in a way that would ensure optimum synergies between the two projects. So the way it turns out, I first focused on the encyclopedia, which gave me a chance to work with so many expert authors and become aware of all the latest, most recent references on all the various topics. And I was able to draw on that updated knowledge from this collaboration with so many authors to update my second part of the textbook, where I give references to important publications. So now it's very closely intertwined in terms of I benefited greatly from working on the encyclopedia to not miss important developments in the field, to have this covered in the textbook, especially part 2. And on the other hand, in the textbook, I was no longer forced to have references to further readings in terms of the actual publications, but now I merely refer to the entries in the encyclopedia for further reading as an intermediate step, because then students reading the textbook are referred to that entry, and in that entry they will get an overview and all the detailed references on this headword. So right now, the way it's turned out, by this design, the two books are actually closely interrelated. The first edition was related to the Interpreting Studies reader that I co-edited with Miriam Schlesinger, and now I think the second edition is very closely related in terms of content, very well coordinated with the encyclopedia.
Let us start with the encyclopedia. You edited it with the support of Nadia Grbic, with Peter Mead and Robin Seton. It is a book that you dedicate to a late friend, Miriam Schlesinger, who passed away a few years ago. It covers 450 pages. It's the ABCs of interpreting. Everything from accent all the way down to zero rendition is covered in it. If you want to know who's who in interpreting studies, I think all you need to do is thumb through the book, 300,000 words. My computer tells me it would take me 28 hours non-stop if I were to read it cover to cover. That's the calculation I get. 139 contributors, 30 different countries. And yet, with very few exceptions, it turns out that most contributions come from scholars from within the field. So my question is, why the decision of having the field described from within rather than perhaps from the outside, or one could argue for a more balanced approach between the two?
Wow, that is a curious question. I really never thought about having outsiders write about our field. Basically, No. Who could provide an expert account of interpreting research, if not interpreting researchers? And I think our community is largely made up of scholars with a background in interpreting. And so I think it's hard to use a percentage, but maybe 80% at least of the authors are people who have contributed, who have shaped this field. And I think if I had to rely on outsiders, there are not that many people in other disciplines who take such a strong interest in our field and write articles about it. There are some exceptions, and actually quite a few. For instance, let's see, in the historical entries, I found that we didn't have too many colleagues focusing on specific cultural traditions in different countries. For instance, interpreting in Roman times, interpreting in the Ottoman Empire, came across references by experts in history or in other fields, but not in our discipline. So yes, they were brought in, but only after the first round of covering the members of our research community. Really, it was fairly obvious to me that this is a collective effort by our community, by our research community, which is made up of the members of our research community, so whom you call insiders. Yeah, so they're insiders, but there's some very interesting examples of people in other disciplines who are also represented, but of course not without having contributed to our field from their perspective before. Otherwise, they would not be considered.
So how do you get this community to pitch in? Some of us have attempted, successfully or not, to edit a book with a dozen contributors, maybe 24 contributors. This is 130 plus contributors. How does one go about that?
Just ask them and ask them in a way, I think, where they couldn't refuse. And I think
Tell us more.
The idea was that you would ask people who have worked on that specific headword, on that specific topic, done their PhD on something, or written a book about something. So isn't it obvious that this person would have to spend the least effort to summarize the knowledge, the state of the art on this particular part of the vast territory of interpreting studies? And I thought, yes, go for these expert specialized authors. And so in most cases, maybe because it would also involve citing their own work, presenting in part their own achievement, and this was very much intended, people had no problem saying an enthusiastic yes. Okay, so I've worked on this, I've published what I get to represent this achievement in the encyclopedia. Why not? So really, most responses were very enthusiastic. And it was easy sending out polite requests, finding in the vast majority an enthusiastic, favorable response to this idea. I might qualify by saying that for the big topics, there may be something like a reference publication fatigue in our field, because this encyclopedia is not the first effort to represent the state of knowledge in a handbook or encyclopedia. And for some topics, I had responses like, what, not again? I've been asked to write about my topic in this handbook, in that handbook, and in the other handbook, not again. And there's actually quite some duplication. Different publishers are putting out these reference volumes. But I think it's even increasing. We're still under this trend, so maybe we were doing this early enough. At least it's the first encyclopedia focusing only on interpreting.
I think that's a very good point, and I've definitely noticed that there's an abundance now of handbooks, of companion volumes. This, I believe, is the first encyclopedia indeed dedicated to interpreting studies only. But what would you say, as a sales pitch, to anyone interested, what would you say they can only find in this encyclopedia that they can't find anywhere else? How is it different? How does it set itself apart from previous attempts at doing this?
Question. What could you find only in here? I'm not good with sales pitches. But let's see. One thing, starting from the very end, you might get, or you will get, if you buy this book, you will get the most comprehensive and correct bibliography of interpreting research.
I hear 2,100 approximately.
Yes, that's good value for money in itself. So that's one thing. But if we go back to the beginning, I was actually asking myself this question when the publisher's request came in. So edit another reference publication, and I don't need to cite the other comparable publications. Interpreting had been covered in various handbooks and encyclopedias, and my first reaction was exactly that. What could be in this book that's new, that's different, that hasn't already been covered? And therefore, the decision that the internal design would be quite different from what we had before, where the big topics, the domains, the professional settings were covered, like court interpreting, conference interpreting, sign language interpreting, and the various handbooks or media interpreting would cover these major domains. That would be the basic structure. And so to do it like that, I think would be duplication. So the idea was to have a very fine-grained, finely meshed network of knowledge items. That's why I ended up with 221 headwords and to show in this book how these items of our knowledge about interpreting are interrelated. So that's really what you get in this book. You get a finely meshed network of knowledge about interpreting rather than a broadly categorized handbook covering various major domains. So it's the interrelationship, ideally a hypertext. I don't think this is available in any of the other reference publications.
Mm-hmm. No, I looked at both books. Have not yet read them cover to cover, not every single word, but it's on my bucket list. It looks to me as though the encyclopedia, as you mentioned before, is a bit of a database containing a lot of knowledge, but perhaps not enough to really fully operationalize it. So would I be right in saying that that framework you required to properly operationalize the knowledge in the encyclopedia would then be contained in introducing interpreting studies?
I think you would be perfectly right in saying that. Yeah, I think it's in the nature of an encyclopedia, I think, to be a repository of that knowledge, and it's organized alphabetically, which is a drawback, which is not a logical structure or order. So yes, that is the main purpose, to bring it together, organized according to this non-thematic principle. And that's why, for student purposes, to gain an overview, to get an explanation of how it all fits together, having a textbook is a very useful complement, I think, to give a quick overview. And so, as I said earlier, the way these two publications then work together is, I can't use the word ideal, can I? But it's pretty much ideal for my standards. So it's nice to have both, definitely. Yeah.
Now, if we look at them separately, would you say that the readership that the authors and you, as the editor, had in mind, or the author had in mind, was different from one to the other? Were the two drafted with MA students in mind, with PhD students working on their dissertation, other scholars first and foremost, or also, if even possible, just the average guy in the street who knows nothing about interpreting?
Well, if I start logically with the textbook, which was the first publication, and since this is only a second edition, it's still basically the same book but an updated version. Yes, the target audience was very much MA students, possibly also PhD students if they have not had the experience of doing their MA in a program where they would have been exposed to the basics and the theory of interpreting studies. So that is the primary audience for the textbook, definitely. Whereas the encyclopedia, as I explained, also has this group of users, because through the textbook they get reference to further reading, and they check in the encyclopedia if they do their thesis on an anticipation, for instance. So I first tell them how it developed and what it means, and then they go to the encyclopedia, they read the entry on anticipation, and they find all the actual references, and they take it from there. So they're the same user group, but for the encyclopedia, the circle of users, the target audience is, I would hope, much broader. I would think that scholars in other disciplines or specialists within translation studies who want to branch out into a different domain would mainly, they would not have a need for the textbook, but they would want easy, quick access to a different set of headwords in the encyclopedia. So broader, yes, including scholars, other academics in translation studies, and also in other disciplines. As to the guy in the street, which might be female also, right, if we are gender sensitive,
yes.
The guy in the street, she might be better served maybe reading, accessing some more journalistic presentations of what interpreting is all about. So this would not be the primary audience. I remember a radio program, a 4-part radio program on Austrian public radio last year that covered interpreting. What is this? It was so well done. Conference interpreting, court interpreting, asylum hearings. So these media nowadays can do so much to reach out to a more general audience. I don't think that consulting an encyclopedia is the easiest way of. It's too scholarly, too academic in its format, I guess, for the guy in the street.
Did you have to, or did you make any attempt at streamlining the style, speaking of the different entries, and there's many of them, and how challenging was that, if at all? Or did they all come in, did the submissions all come in more or less the way you would have liked them to eventually figure in an encyclopedia? I think it's not something one usually does as a scholar. You don't usually write encyclopedia articles, you write journal articles.
Oh, yes.
Oh, do tell.
This is probably the greatest trauma with this whole encyclopedia editing experience. What you said last is what I had naively expected things to be. That people would simply submit their entries and I would put them together. It turned out quite differently, and there was a lot of editing involved. In order to initially really based on the fact that, as you say, this is a particular genre. How do you write an encyclopedia entry? And especially since this is not the dozen figures who have been in the field for decades and know it all, but very often specialized authors who may have done only, quote unquote, only their PhD, but then cover this. So the genre of an encyclopedia entry is very new. And these authors needed a lot of guidance and feedback of where to put things, how specific to be. So it was a great learning process. But also for me, after a while, though, if you do only that, editing submissions for encyclopedia entries, you tend to develop a sense of a feel for how it should read. And so by the time I had edited the first couple of dozen entries, I think I was in quite a good position, together also with Nadia Grbic, who did a lot of the reviewing and reading and discussing with me as a consultant, associate editor, to provide very specific feedback and to be pretty sure about what would work and what wouldn't work. Because that was the genre I was working on for months, whereas for other people it's a strange sideline and you do it once. So by the time in our minds, in my mind, a kind of a format and a feel and a style had developed, it became pretty easy to then apply this, but it did mean a lot of editorial guidance and interference, a lot of editorial work on the submitted manuscripts, which, as you suggest, this is a two-way thing. It's a different genre. I don't blame any authors if they are not born as encyclopedia entry authors, but it was much more editing work than I had ever imagined.
Mm-hmm. How many years in the making for the encyclopedia? From day one when you got the request?
Signed on in 2011. And then there was this idea in my proposal that I would want to work with maybe half a dozen experts in different domains, maybe sign language interpreting, conference interpreting, and I contacted these colleagues, and most of them were smart enough to be aware of the workload and said no. It's a great project, I'd love to, but no way, I'm too busy. And so there was actually a stretch after I had signed on where I thought, how am I going to do this? On my own, it will not work. It was quite some time lost. And then I think the main source of rejuvenation there was Nadia Grubic, based in Graz, who really in this initial stage, getting things off the ground and then later reviewing the articles, was exceptionally active with her input, and we sort of worked on the same wavelength. And working with her made it possible then to finalize the list of headwords and authors. So I think doing it on one's own would be extremely difficult. So then once, the same thing for the editing. If you read something you think this will not work, this cannot be accepted like this. It's only my personal opinion initially, but then somebody else read it and she felt about it the same way. That's supremely reassuring. And then we would get back to the author. I would write to the author and say, sorry, major rewriting required. And so let's see, 2013, 14 then was the hot phase, papers, entries coming in. And then the final year of intense editing for maybe more than a year. That's all I did for a year. It feels like it.
Lucky you.
So much, that's the timeline.
The worst things you could have been doing.
Like what? Oh, you asked the questions. I'm sorry.
Let's move to the introducing, as I call it, introducing interpreting studies, and particularly the three last chapters, which I think probably, in my view at least, add a lot of new stuff over the previous version. There's one on technology, there's one on education or training, and then there's one in the future of interpreting research. And perhaps we can spend a little time talking about those three areas. What did you experience, also as editor-in-chief of Interpreting, as the most significant changes that you've witnessed since the first release in 2004 with regard to interpreting studies and technology? So how has technology, if at all, I assume it has, influenced the submissions you get, or just the field in general, over the past 10 years?
Technology is mentioned, I think, in the final chapter of the first edition, so that we can expect major developments, but it was still very vague. And to be honest, I would never have expected, for instance, the major developments in the field of machine interpreting. That is the most salient development that's now reflected in the second edition. I remember in this integrated map of the discipline, I had machine interpreting on the rightmost top corner as, yes, it exists and it should be on the map, but it's really, marginal. That's the way it felt in the early 2000s. Still, despite the Verbmobile project in Germany in the 1990s, and then in recent years, it really is amazing how much machine interpreting, automatic interpreting, is an issue that we're dealing with, publications, testing of apps and software. So that's one thing. The other is video conference-based, video conference mediated, remote interpreting, the whole issue of remote interpreting. Those would be the two technology-based developments that would come to mind that are now reflected in the second edition that were there only marginally in the first edition, and I would never have expected them to take off like that. Also, in the field of education, I think, blended learning. And I'm not even sure the chapter, my updating of that education chapter really fully does justice to all these recent developments. I think it would involve a lot of rewriting or possibly even a different book introducing interpreter education, new developments in interpreter education. So maybe the editing was, or the updating was rather light in that respect, given all the major developments. I managed to include Robin Setton's and Andrew Doran's book that I had been aware of from being associate editor of the book series in which it appeared. But again, this is not covered in any great detail because, as I said, the updating, the editing was pretty light. Whereas with technology, there's a new chapter. And also history. History is a new development in interpreting studies. There was not that much expertise in the 1990s or early 2000s. I think we all basically refer to Margareta Bowen's chapter in the DeLisle and Woodsworth volume for a summary of research on the history of interpreting. And look what's happened in recent years. And so that, again, I felt merited a chapter on its own. So those would be two examples of major developments. But with technology, since I mentioned teaching, corpus-based, corpus-linguistic applications are also a technology-based development that we have seen in recent years and that just made it into the second edition.
Mm-hmm. Great. Moving away from the books a little bit, talking about education and interpreter training and trends that I believe we all observed in the past 5-10 years with an increase in the density of interpreter training programs in some countries, notably the United Kingdom, notably also Spain, and then a stagnation, if not the opposite development in countries such as, for example, Germany, or in general, German-speaking countries with fewer programs on offer. What do you make of that?
You mentioned Spain, the UK. I think there are interesting trends that come mainly from those different sociocultural environments. In Spain, for instance, I would think of the heyday in the 1990s, this wave of creating training institutions, coupled with regulations saying that if you want to have a full-time teaching position at a university, you need to get a PhD. And I think I mentioned that in the first edition, even that this is a major driving force, for better or worse, forcing people to take an interest in academic work. And so that generated a lot of momentum. But I see this mainly related to these earlier periods. The pressure probably hasn't stopped nowadays in Spain, but I would have expected you to mention one country where this drive and this momentum is infinitely greater, and that's China. So it's based on these certain national, cultural, social environments. We get fascinating developments. Universities do things. They think they need a policy promoting interpreting training. In other countries, everybody tries to speak English. The language policy officially is we don't care to have interpreters as long as we can communicate. And so this will drive demand also negatively, as you suggest. Even though in Austria, for instance, I don't see a decline. You mentioned Germany. In Austria, the situation has been very stable. 3 universities offering interpreter and translator training. No change at all. In Germany, I don't see a major decline, really. I don't know. You had some extremely impressive statistics about the encyclopedia initially. I don't know where your evidence is for this decline in Germany. It seems to be pretty stable with the universities.
I might be saying something wrong, but I'm not sure that Berlin still trains interpreters.
No,
Dresda used to train interpreters. So there are a few schools that all of a sudden disappeared.
Yes, yeah.
And perhaps there are reasons
some decline.
for that you might
some decline.
know.
But I guess there is if we go beyond conference interpreting, there would be a need even to have more training in different languages, specialization in dialogue interpreting, for instance. So I would consider that situation largely stable. Whereas in China, of course, we have this big boom, this amazing expansion. Brazil would be another interesting case, African countries. So I think it's fascinating how it's not theories or research trends that have an impact on what happens in different countries, but it really comes bottom up from some national policy preferences and needs that often boils down to university regulations, what people are forced to do or not to do, whether you have a curriculum that has a thesis requirement or no thesis requirement, that kind of shapes development in our field. And it will be interesting to have a broader overview of what's happening in different countries. Also has to do, if we focus on conference interpreting, I think with more mature markets or newer markets in German-speaking environments, I think we would consider them mature training environments where the basic needs have been catered for quite a while. And so there's not really a boom atmosphere or that much of a fresh demand, especially in relation to using English as a lingua franca. And other cultural regions are not as susceptible to or embracing that to such an extent. I think of Brazil, for instance, where sometimes I think the situation might be comparable to what we had in the 70s and 80s in the Central European market, where being an interpreter was still much more important because people didn't use other languages to such an extent in their specialties. Same changes might be expected in China in 20 years from now. But so there's a very differentiated picture in different national and cultural traditions.
In the last chapter of the book, of the textbook, you talk about the future of interpreting research. And you mention at some point that most, if not all, of the recent large-scale studies that were commissioned by large institutional employers, and talking about the UN and organizations and talking about the European institutions, were actually commissioned with and carried out by professional research outfits with very little and sometimes no input of professional interpreters. What do you make of that? What does that tell us about, and what is your take on what that tells us about the maturity of the field, which is a young field? We all know this. Interpreting studies, whether we call it interpreting studies or translation studies, is very young. Where are we in terms of maturing? Have we earned our rites of passage? Or are we still in this infant state and sometimes belittled by other fields of study? And that is why, at least in the eye of some beholders, we're not able to deliver the goods that they want.
Well, infants no longer, I think. Toddlers, at least. No, I think we've come a long way, definitely progressed a lot in terms of methodology and having a defined state-of-the-art resources that we can agree. A consensus in the field that this is what we have, this is what we can work with. So in a sense, a lot more consolidation, and as I claim in the textbook, and maturity. But maybe not enough power and coherence as a research field compared to other disciplines. Maybe we're not visible enough for these big institutions to be aware of us as the experts on this topic and for us to be commissioned with research projects. On the other hand, how many of these examples do we really have? How many major international institutions who spend hefty sums on this have a real interest in commissioning research? Maybe these projects are examples rather, exceptions rather than the rule. Maybe 2 or 3 big studies. Some are done in-house, maybe by European institutions, which is, of course, also not a bad idea. But maybe there is not enough of that perceived need on the part of employers or other public institutions to say, we need research into how well our healthcare system functions with or without interpreters. Let's commission some research. I think if we had more of that, automatically there would be more requests to universities, to researchers to do that. So if we have such a small sample, N is 2 or 3, can we really say that this is an indication that they don't see us as competent enough or mature enough? I think, unfortunately, there's very little of that commissioned research. I think we're in a much better position nowadays to do this. Ultimately, though, we're still, as I discovered, editing the encyclopedia, still a very small field. There are experts all over the place, but usually and very often working on their own in a particular university or country or a city. So if it were a big project that requires some on-site collaboration, the landscape is really sparsely populated. Usually you're lucky to have one real expert in interpreting research in a given university. And that then makes it difficult for that person to take on such a project because it would involve a lot of virtual work and networking. Not everybody is as lucky as you people here in Geneva, where you have, for instance, interpreting research, different methodologies covered, qualitative research, experimental research. So that is, to me, an ideal example of having the critical mass. So if I had to commission research, I would consider, apart from considering the University of Vienna, I would actually consider approaching the FTI, because this is quite a center of expertise and excellence. Yeah, and I'm not only saying this because then you will offer me to take home this mug as a special, but yeah, I think we're still a very small, albeit international field.
So if I'm going to ask you to put on your editor's hat, you see lots of manuscripts. Obviously, most of them you farm out, but you read through them diagonally. What strikes you as the most common shortcoming, where you say to yourself, this is a great idea. If only they'd been able to generate this, do that, that would have perhaps made it into a much stronger project. Is it really only the N? Is it really only the number of participants, which I think we've, at this point, just had to settle for what we get? We will not have the same power behind our statistics, certainly not if we try to inject it through the number of participants, as I don't know, experimental psychology that uses undergraduate students, and they can have 100, 200 participants if they give them class credit for it.
Well, before I begin, an objection. You said all these manuscripts that we read diagonally. No, yeah. In order to process submission and decide whether it should be moved further, it's good enough, or whether it should be rejected because it's not promising enough, you really actually have to read it very carefully, because especially when we as editors decide that something will not be sent to reviewers, we have to justify that decision. So that first round is very time consuming, and you have to read things very carefully and give examples and point out the weaknesses. So yeah, no diagonal reading, I wish. But these weaknesses, I think it wouldn't be so interested to focus on these weaker submissions that we do not pass on to the peer review stage. All kinds of reasons for that, not having to do with methodology in every case. So I think no use discussing that.
So much the ones you discard, but the ones you take on, but you think, gosh, this could have been so much better if, seeing that you have the overview.
Yeah, and for those that we take on, I think we don't notice any major shortcomings. If there were a major shortcoming, it will be in the first batch. It says, if only you had clearly formulated a relevant research question. Yeah, there are cases like that.
It's a good starting point.
Yeah. And so no major shortcomings, and it's usually the expert reviewers, based on their specific experience and knowledge, who might come up with these kinds of suggestions. And then it's a matter of, okay, it would be nice to incorporate that, to consider that. Sometimes it can be done, sometimes it can be explained on the part of the author why it couldn't be done. So I don't think there's anything, whether it's quantitative issues or once it's past that initial stage that you have a clearly formulated question and a sensible approach to methodologically to answer that question, it's considered a promising manuscript for publication. It would be nice to have my co-editor here to help me answer that question, but I don't think that there is any issue that comes up again and again where it said this needs to be watched out for. This is like a persistent weakness in the various submissions. One reason being that the field has become so broad and so diverse that you get ethnographic inquiries in very specific settings, or religious volunteer interpreting, for instance, police settings. What would be, the N? There's so much qualitative work where the N isn't really of much relevance. Lots of field work, case studies, and so this diversity of approaches and methods makes it impossible to identify any recurrent shortcomings, I think.
Great. I'd like your thoughts on a term that is thrown around a lot. We hear a lot of interdisciplinarity in interpreting studies. And yet when I look a little more closely, often what I see is one of Daniel Gilles', at least he coined the term, practice searchers, so somebody who's a practitioner who becomes a researcher, applying a method that is perhaps not as widely used as another, and that is sometimes passed off as being interdisciplinary. What is your take on interdisciplinarity? This is a discussion that's been going on for some time. I know Miriam herself was certainly somebody who always pushed for interdisciplinarity somewhat differently, as in recruiting people from the outside and really bridging the gap and reaching across the sometimes perceived gap between us, or the moat that we have dug. Obviously, you see where I'm coming from, to protect ourselves from other disciplines that, again, they have a stronger and a longer tradition, and therefore we're not always immediately on a level playing field. How do you perceive that? Again, as editor, looking at the things that are submitted, if you were to give me a percentage, I know you're unprepared for this, but do you know off the top of your head roughly how many submissions are co-authored, at least if not authored, by people who are not practitioners, which is not the standard profile we would have?
That is so difficult to say, really. On a broader level, it seems that there weren't too many cognitive scientists who made interpreting research their priority, or who were so interested in joining in. It wasn't for lack of openness, I think, and interest on the part of interpreting researchers. I think the days where we really dug a moat would have been over. I think what Daniel Gilles wrote is that was very inviting. It was but I think the response may have been disappointing. That people, expert scholars in other disciplines, are too busy doing their own things, rather than saying, "Oh, interpreting such, yeah, let me collaborate with you, co-author a paper." So that is one domain. In the domain of dialogue interpreting, on the other hand, I think there is a lot of interdisciplinarity by virtue of research expertise in studying interaction and conversation, for instance. So there was a time, I think, when I would have said no, interdisciplinarity didn't really work out for conference and simultaneous interpreting research, but with the huge development in dialogue interpreting in recent years and decades, I think there is a lot of interdisciplinary input, and we get work by sociologists, by discourse analysts who are not professionals of interpreting, who contribute greatly to our field and who are published also in journals like Interpreting. So it has to do a little bit with the domain that we're studying and the kind of questions we're asking. It seems that the cognitive orientations we haven't generated this kind of interdisciplinary response and input, whereas dialogue interpreting research, think of people like Ian Mason, for instance. He was not originally an interpreting scholar, but we would consider him leading guidance and a major contributor to that field of research. And other linguists or researchers in pragmatics have done the same. And most recently, if you think of the book done by our Italian colleagues, Laura Gavioli and Claudio Baraldi, sociologists, sociolinguists working on dialogue interpreting, I think there's quite a strong trend. And what is that if not interdisciplinarity in a very pure form?
I have a perhaps final question, also seeing that we're slowly but surely running out of time. At some point in your book, you talk about the role and the status of interpreters and how interpreters need to expect their role and their status to be affected by the changes that affect the world of interpreting. Can you say a little more about that, particularly seeing that we have a number of students here in the audience who are explicitly training to become interpreters? What is there for them to expect?
I don't think your question is phrased specifically enough. You talk about interpreters. Really?
Okay, we have a crowd of young people who want to become conference interpreters specifically. What do you do with that?
So really, again, we need to see what about status and role and prestige of the conference interpreting profession. We could talk about that. Because overall, I guess there are domains of the profession. There are different interpreting professions. Sign language interpreters probably will be enjoying a rise in their status and importance. This is more generally acknowledged, their role, their need, the need for training. Same for court interpreting, maybe. The directive has at least created some legal foundations for every country to make sure that qualified interpreters, even registers of qualified interpreters, are available. This should feed back into training. So various interpreting professions might expect a rise in terms of status and a promising development. Now, what about the conference interpreting profession? Everything being relative, probably I would not expect this domain to be moving upward as quickly and steeply as some of these other domains. Again, it depends on where you're working. I think in the European context, with the language policy in the European Union in place, we can expect there to be some stable demand for this very specialized communication skill and service. I don't see this as slipping or declining. Demands might be rising in terms of how many working languages you have or ability to work with technology. But that is one segment of the market. In other countries, the issue of English as a lingua franca is definitely changing needs and demand for interpreting, probably in some markets leading to a decline or a shrinkage of the market. And whether that is linked then to the profession losing some of its attractiveness or status, possibly so. So our only comfort, is that on the whole, the interpreting professions, I think, are developing very dynamically. But these developments, whether they're upward or downward moves, need to be differentiated in terms of the professional domain, the national, regional situation, the language needs, the language policies in different environments. And so I'm obviously an optimist, so for the bigger picture, I see things moving upward and onward all the time.
Which wonderful. On that optimistic note, Franz, thank you very much for having found your way to Geneva today for this table talk, for having shared your thoughts with us, your insights, your wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, to Franz Martega from Vienna.
Thank you.